Is there a time and place for an all or nothing mentality when it comes to hyperpalatable foods? Let's talk about it. I'll see you inside. Okay, so oftentimes I talk about not having an all or nothing mentality when it comes to diet and exercise. This simply means that you can try and construct a life in which you make healthy choices, such as going out for exercise or trying to stick to a healthy dietary pattern as much as possible. But just because you slip up every once in a while doesn't mean that you should quit altogether. It simply means that you should get on track the next time that you have the opportunity. And this is why I often recommend not falling into the trap of having an all or nothing mentality. But I think there is one facet of life, and this is actually the consumption of hyperpalatable foods, where an all or nothing mentality, meaning that you don't eat them at all, might actually be helpful and beneficial, at least for a period of time. Hyperpalatable foods are foods that are actually specifically curated to cause us to want to overconsume them. As crazy as it sounds, a lot of big corporations and businesses, like maybe Doritos or Lay's or Cheerios or other companies like that, actually have food scientists working in the background to make different formulations that actually appease the palate so much that we eat more and more and more of them. And we actually kind of know how they do this. These foods actually contain a specific ratio of fat, carbohydrate, and salt that appease both the palate and the brain in such a way that we crave these foods even when we're not even that hungry. Additionally, when we do eat them when we're hungry, they don't satisfy us, so we continue to eat and eat and eat, and we don't stop because there's really no satiation mechanisms that they have. And what I mean by this is they actually curate these products by almost removing anything that would cause satiation. So typically these foods are very easy to digest. They don't take up much volume, and they actually have very, very low levels of protein in them. And the reason for this is because humans actually have what is referred to as a protein appetite. And it seems that humans will actually unconsciously eat until they fulfill a certain amino acid requirement. And it has actually been demonstrated in studies that humans actually almost eat unconsciously to the exact same level of protein, regardless of what food they're actually eating. For example, one of these studies is actually putting people at a buffet where they're allowed to eat calories freely. They do this over different days, and they use different types of buffets that have different meal choices. And now, let's say the first buffet is structured in such a way that once you have filled up your plate, it's very likely you'll have about 25% of your calories coming from protein. If you have this protein appetite to drive you to eat about 50 grams of protein at a single sitting, this means 50 grams of protein being 25% of your calories, you will consume 400 calories in that meal until you feel satiated. And then they will bring these participants back the next day and put them at a different buffet. And this buffet would have something like 10% of their total calories coming from protein, meaning that the food is structured in such a way that once they've filled up their plate, about 10% of the plate is actually made up of protein. And astonishingly, what these researchers found is that they will actually eat until they get the same amount, being 50 grams, of protein as the day before. However, if only 10% of the food that they're eating is coming from protein, in order to get this 50 grams, they end up consuming about 2,000 calories. So these studies demonstrate that people do not simply eat to a caloric amount, but rather they eat to a protein amount. And this appears to be very unconscious. And food manufacturers have actually understood this, and they remove the protein from the food so that we don't unconsciously begin to feel full. And the thought of stopping eating doesn't even come into our brain. I mean, if you really think about it, if you look at a box of cereal or a bag of chips, unless they have specifically made the chips so that they have extra protein for a health benefit, these things will have very, very low levels of protein. And now this will avoid the satiety mechanism, but there are so many factors that also cause us to overeat them. We can first look at glucose. Every single hyperpalatable food will actually have glucose in it, even if it doesn't taste sweet. And this is extremely interesting because it's often added not for taste, but rather because we actually have sensors in our stomach that can sense glucose and send a signal to the brain that there is glucose present in our food. And that signal that's sent to our brain lets us remember for the next time that this food has glucose in it. And there will actually be a larger increase in dopamine, therefore that food will become more salient over other foods that may not have as much glucose in the future. This is why oftentimes people don't crave very, very extremely dense dark chocolate, but milk chocolate is much easier to overconsume on. And there certainly are studies that demonstrate the power of these non-taste receptors for sensing glucose. So you can actually knock out any taste sensation in a mouse, but if you provide them two different drinking solutions, one just being plain water and the other being water with sugar, they actually will begin to drink just the water with the sugar in it. But as I mentioned, they have no ability to actually taste this sugar, so the water still just tastes exactly like plain water. However, because of the presence of these glucose receptors in our stomach, the animal is able to ascertain that there is glucose present in this water, and it will feel more motivated to choose this water over the normal water. And now the next thing that's included in hyperpalatable foods is the presence of fat. Specifically, a lot of times they do not include saturated fat, rather they include polyunsaturated fats. And while there is a very strong argument as to why polyunsaturated fats could actually be detrimental, that's not even the reason why this is very important. While it does not appear that there are abundance of taste benefits for including fat, it appears that the molecules of fat actually signal that there is abundance of energy, and they increase the palatability of the food, simply the mouth feeling and mouth texture of hyperpalatable foods. Additionally, fat is simply just easy to break down and digest, so the more we can add into the food, the easier each bite will be to digest. And the reason for this is because certain foods actually have a thermic effect, meaning that let's say you consume about 100 calories of protein. On average, you will actually expend about 25 calories to digest that 100 calories of protein. So in the end, you actually only yield about 75 calories. And that is just a rough estimate that varies between individuals and different food sources. The same is true with carbohydrates, but it's more of around 10 to 15%, meaning that for 100 calories of carbohydrates, you may actually only net about 90 calories. But for fat, you actually only take about 1% of the total caloric yield to digest it. So if you ingest 100 calories, you'll likely actually yield about 99 calories, which means that there's really no energy expenditure or digestive distress whatsoever to digest these foods. Therefore, there really won't be a signal to our body that we need to take time to actually digest the food to stop us from eating it. And the final thing that they put into hyperpalatable foods is salt, even in sweet foods. Put simply, we have taste receptors that actually sense electrolytes. And going back to my favorite topic of evolution, we actually have a craving for electrolytes oftentimes, specifically for sodium. Therefore, most hyperpalatable foods will just make sure that there is sodium as much as possible if there's not already high sodium content in the foods. This is why oftentimes even candies have high levels of sodium in them, because they actually have salt. And now let me give you a really great example of this. A perfect example is actually looking at a whole potato versus a potato chip. It has actually been found that a boiled plain potato appears to be one of, if not the most satiating foods on the planet. However, I think, in my opinion, and probably in the opinion of a lot of people, potato chips may very likely be the least satiating food on the planet. But it's made out of the exact same ingredients, except a potato chip is dehydrated and they add other ingredients to make this hyperpalatable formulation. Initially, they actually break down the very complex starch molecules into very easily to digest glucose molecules. They also process these foods in such a way that they add in many oils and salt to increase both of these contents that make the food more palatable. And the dehydration effect makes the food less volumized, meaning that we won't get what is referred to as volumetric satiety. And I think you kind of understand what this means, but Volumetric satiety is when you've filled up your stomach so much that you actually trigger stretch receptors in your stomach that feed back into your brain to tell you to stop eating. But because these potato chips are so easy to digest and so dehydrated, you can eat an entire bag and barely feel like you've touched a piece of food. And I would say that the only mechanism that may actually stop you from overconsuming potato chips is the abundance of salt and not having sufficient water, so you actually begin to get dehydrated. Therefore, I think the best way to overeat on potato chips is pairing it with a Gatorade or soda, because the water will help facilitate the electrolytes to get into the cell and you won't get cellular dehydration. And the glucose in the drink will also aid with this as well. But now let's say we take a look at these ingredients on their own. Like I said, a potato seems to be one of, if not the most satiating foods on the planet. Additionally, nobody's going to sit down with a bottle of canola oil and begin drinking it and find it rewarding. However, when it's combined into this food matrix with a carbohydrate and salt, it's the perfect texture, consistency, and palatability that we just continue to eat it and eat it and eat it. I think many people can kind of think of a time where they ate a lot of potato chips and never felt full. They simply stopped eating because they had something better to do. And I do think this potato chip phenomenon can actually help us with how we can feel more satiated when we're eating, maybe even just changing up the order in which we eat or just combining foods in a certain way. We can use an idea referred to as the protein leveraging hypothesis to actually promote early satiety in a meal. This would simply be trying to eat sufficient protein at the beginning of every meal if our goal is to become satiated such that we don't overeat. Additionally, it also appears that there are sensors in the gut that actually respond to the ingestion of saturated fat. And these receptors actually produce neurochemicals that make us feel satiated. Therefore, we may not even actually have to change what we eat, just how we eat it. Just ingesting protein and saturated fat at the beginning of the meal, and then almost just eating carbohydrates to appetite at the end of the meal. This would allow us to unconsciously reduce our intake and make sure that we're getting in these important nutrient-dense foods at the beginning of the meal. And now the other thing I want to mention is something that not many people want to hear, but I think it would be very helpful to actually stay away from hyperpalatable foods, at least for a brief period of time. It actually seems that our taste receptors regenerate in a fairly short period of time. Therefore, while it may be difficult, if we avoid hyperpalatable foods for around 7 to 10 days, we will reset our palate and regenerate a new set of cells that we can actually introduce to natural foods like fruit, fresh proteins, and dietary fat, and build up this kind of rewarding sensation that we typically would have gotten out of hyperpalatable foods. This is almost like developing an entirely new palate in a very brief period of time. By just letting new cells regenerate and not exposing those cells to hyperpalatable foods, but rather foods that should actually be palatable but have been dampened down by the extreme sweetness of hyperpalatable foods. And not just sweetness, but savory and saltiness. Then when we take a piece of fruit, we eat it and it tastes exactly like an M&M. Simply, it may not actually be how sweet a given food is that sends a reward signal, rather how sweet it is in comparison to what we have exposed our taste receptors to in the past. And the human mind works like this in many facets of life. This is why social media begins to feel much more rewarding than having a one-to-one conversation oftentimes. Social media has much more dopaminergically engaging characteristics. Therefore, when we compare meeting a person and speaking to them to engaging with them on social media, it just doesn't feel quite as rewarding and quite as appealing. However, we see that before social media, conversations and large gatherings were extremely gratifying and rewarding to earlier generations. And the same appears to hold true with food. Modern-day hunter-gatherers actually go crazy for natural foods like honey and fruits. Simply, fruit and honey is their version of candy. Our version of candy is Skittles and M&Ms. And because we're eating these things all the time, it causes fruit and honey to taste almost bland. And we can actually look even further into this topic to just see how detrimental these modern foods are. Because when given the opportunity, if an individual from one of the modern day hunter gatherer tribes is exposed to westernized foods, such as moving to a place where there's grocery stores and gas stations, they quickly develop the same dietary habits that many overweight and obese Americans have, and they seem to develop diabetes and obesity at extremely rapid rates compared to all of their relatives who are still currently living as hunter gatherers. And that's why things like diabetes and obesity are actually referred to as diseases of Western civilization, because it appears that they are almost always the result of the modern foods and lifestyles that we currently are living. So, once again, coming back to important takeaways is trying to actually make a healthy food actually be the most rewarding food that you eat in a period of time. So take a piece of fresh fruit and try and make that the sweetest thing that you ingest. Eventually, you'll begin to crave fruit and no longer crave M&Ms and Skittles. This is because you have begun to dampen down the strong connections that you had in your brain with M&Ms for a period of time and build up a strong connection with fruit. Simply at the moment, every time that you go back to a candy or eating a bag of M&Ms, you get a reward and you build a stronger association with eating M&Ms. This really is the neurochemistry of addiction, and it's the same process that occurs in drug addiction, cigarette addiction, and alcohol addiction. The more often you return back to the same reward, the stronger the neural connections become. Therefore, anytime you're looking for a reward, it becomes almost reflexive that you think of this reward and then you begin to crave it. And now changing this may take a little bit longer than your taste buds, but taking a period of time in which you are avoiding hyperpalatable foods to try and actually dampen down and weaken that neural connection, and over days actually trying to strengthen a connection with something like fruit as being extremely gratifying and sweet, literally replacing the M&Ms in your mind with fruit. And it appears you can build the exact same response. So I guess if you really wanted to take something away from this podcast, it is that if you play your cards correctly, you can turn an orange in your mind into an M&M. And you can literally get the same gratification out of an orange as you would have gotten out of candy. However, you'll be getting far more micronutrients, vitamin C, potassium, and antioxidants out of that orange. And maybe we bring this all the way back around to the earlier topic. Maybe if you eat a few eggs before you eat the orange, you'll get the protein to fill your amino acid drive, the saturated fat to promote early satiety, and then when you eat the orange, you'll actually promote a signal of dopamine. And it's very interesting that when you get a surge of dopamine, one mechanism to actually return your dopamine levels back to normal is the production of serotonin. And this will actually increase your satiety even more, and it will provide you with this like stable gratification to stop eating and not to feel hungry until your next meal. So I think I simply kind of just explained the neurochemistry of why I recommend many people eat eggs and fruit for breakfast. And now the last thing I'll try and leave you with is a few examples. We can replace a breakfast of cereal with eggs and fruit, and maybe replace a lunch that would typically be pizza with simply just a quality protein and a bunch of natural foods like potatoes. Or if you prefer a lower carbohydrate approach, you can replace this with a meat and cheese roll-up. Finally, maybe replacing a meal of pasta and sauce with a meal of steak and a beautiful array of fruits and vegetables. It truly is extremely easy to formulate something that will both nourish your body and feel satiating and appetizing, but you simply need to remove the hyperpalatable foods so that your brain isn't thinking about what it's not getting and it's actually just looking at what it is getting from the foods that you're eating. Soon, instead of when you eat a piece of fruit thinking about how you had to replace your M&Ms, you'll begin to look forward to the fruit an hour, 2 hours before the meal, because that becomes your dessert. and you begin to crave these fresh proteins because of the umami flavor that they provide you. And you can truly control your appetite because of all the abundance of amino acids and, depending on what you choose, saturated fat that will also promote early satiety. And I think this is where intuitive eating oftentimes falls short, because if you are intuitively eating natural and whole foods, it will be very easy to regulate your satiety and stop eating before you overconsume. But if you're trying to intuitively eat on Pop Tarts, humans simply don't have the neural circuitry to try and match our hunger and satiety signals with the actual caloric load of these foods. Therefore, we truly just fall into a trap of just continuing to overeat on them even without even knowing it. So, with all of that rambling out of the way, I think the one big thing that I want to leave you with is that if you simply take a period of time to try and change your habits today, you can change both your mind and your palate for the rest of your life. And now, this doesn't mean that you'd be depriving your taste buds and your brain of pleasure for the rest of your life. You would actually be reformulating your pattern and rewiring your brain so that almost any food that you eat gives you the same feelings of pleasure as going to KFC and then going and getting ice cream afterwards. And then on the odd times that you do decide to go to KFC and eat ice cream afterward, the pleasure that you actually feel is likely going to be 10 times higher as if you had been exposing yourself to this every single day over a long period of time. So not only will you make things like steak, eggs, and fruit feel amazing when you eat them, you can derive even more value from the foods that you've likely just adapted to. Okay, before I go on another diatribe, I'm going to end this one here. You can find the links to all of my social medias in the description of this podcast. You can find my writings there in the description as well. And I would love it if you followed me on Instagram at Calvin_Scheller. And I hope to see you in the next episode. Have a great day.